Hello, dear friends. Shavua Tov, Shavua Tov. May this be a good week. I'd like to talk about the portion of the week, which was the double portion again. This is the third time in the book of Leviticus of Vayikra where we read a double portion, and is Behar Behukotai. Now, there's some interesting things about these parshiyot before I talk about even the content. And one is that Parashat Behar, which of course talks about in general the sabbatical, the laws of the sabbatical year, the Shmitta, and the Jubilee, the Yovel. It starts off by saying, and God spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai, saying. Now, why is this significant? Because the book of Vayikra begins where God speaks to Moses in Ohel Moed, in the tabernacle, in the sanctuary that was in the desert, which of course was built more than a year after the Sinai experience. So why does it say that all of a sudden that this was given at Mount Sinai, which means it's out of place because it should have been first what was given at Mount Sinai and then what was given to Moses at Ohel Moed. Well, Rashi claims that this is just to teach you that all the mitzvot were given at Mount Sinai. But when you look in other parshanim, some of them say maybe it's just out of place, and others, like the Seforno and Rashbam, say that it's because these two parshiyot actually go together. How can you see that they go together? Because if we look in Parashat Behukotai, which talks about the blessings and the curses, so specifically from the the sixth aliyah. So right before that, it says, these are the laws, the chukim, and the precepts, the mishpatim, and the Torot and the Torahs that um, God gave between himself and the children of Israel at Mount Sinai through Moses. So again, it reiterates this idea that this parsha also, which talks about the blessings and the curses, was also given at Mount Sinai. And then at the end of Behukotai, which is the end of Vayikra, it also says these are the mitzvot, which God commanded Moses and the children of Israel at Mount Sinai. So it seems that these two parshiyot have a clear connection between each other, that both of them were given at Mount Sinai. Now, another thing I'd like to mention here is that we have another unusual thing here, and that is Parshat Behukotai is one of the two portions in the Torah, the other one being in Deuteronomy 28, Devarim 28, which talk about the blessings and the curses. Now, Nachmanides, Ramban claims that the first one represents what happened in the first temple period and the destruction of the first temple, you had the blessing and the curses. And the second represents the second temple period, where again you had blessings and curses. And the exile mentioned in Devarim, according to Ramban, represents the Roman exile and everything that came after it until our generation. However, according to this interpretation, that would mean that the blessings and the curses are talking in general. If you don't keep the mitzvot, if you keep the mitzvot, you have the blessings. If you don't keep the mitzvot, the commandments, you have the curses, and that's it. However, Rashbam, Rashi's grandson, sees it a little bit differently. He claims that the blessings and the curses in Parashat Behukotai are related to the Parashat Behar, meaning they're related to whether the Jewish people keep the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year, yes or no. If they keep it, they get the blessings. If they don't keep the sabbatical year and the Jubilee, then comes the curses. In other words, he particularly claims that there's a direct relationship between Behar and Behukotai. And Behukotai is talking about when the people do not keep the sabbatical years. Now, it's true that it says Behukotai in my commandments in general, but there is a singling out here of the sabbatical years. For instance, in chapter 26, verse 32, after it says, I will bring the land into desolation, and your enemies will be astonishment how desolate it is, and I shall send you, and I shall scatter you out among the nations, etc. Then it says in verse 34, then the land will be appeased for the Sabbaths that you did not keep. And while you are in the land of your enemies, the land of Israel, meaning the land will be have its rest and receive the sabbaticals it did not receive before. Yirtzad Shabtoteha. So it's drawing a direct connection between what happened, the fact that they were not careful about keeping the Shabbatot, which is the sabbaticals. Even in verse 52, when it talks about the end of the exile, and I will remember the covenant with Jacob and the covenant with Isaac and the covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. And again it says, and the land will be waste, but it will be appeased for the Sabbaths by all this time that it will be barren. And the people of Israel, their iniquities will be atoned, etc. So you have the same thing, this relationship between the curses and the sabbatical year. By the way, at the end of Parashat Behar, there's a very interesting verse, which is also, there's a debate what it means by the various commentators. After the end of Parashat Behar, which of course talks about the sabbatical years, it says, Et Shabtotai Tishmoru, you shall watch my Sabbaths. Umiktashi Tirau, and you shall fear my temple. I am God. Now, the question is that what it means? For instance, Onkelos, the iconic translator of the Torah, and I would say the rabbinically sanctioned translator of the Torah into Aramaic, possibly in the first century, he explains, watch over my Sabbaths, meaning my Sabbath years, which is the Shmitta, the seventh year, the sabbatical years. And Rashbam and even Ezra says, and what does it mean, Mikdashi Tirau? What does it mean with that which is holy, not the temple, the Jubilee? Because it says about the Jubilee, Vikidashtem, it's not the Chamishim Shana. You shall sanctify the 50th year, the Jubilee year. So watching over my Sabbaths is referring to the sabbatical. And here, and what is sanctified is referring to the Jubilee. And that's why it's the proper ending of Parashat Behar. So, and one other thing that has to be mentioned, the Haftarah. I always say there are interesting connections with the Haftarah and the Torah reading. The Haftarah for Behukotai, which talks about the blessings and the curses, is a Haftarah from Yirmiyahu, I think it's 17, where Yirmiyahu says, blessed is the man who goes in the way of God, and cursed is the man who doesn't trust in God, etc. But that's it. He doesn't talk about the exile or anything. Specifically, the Haftarah from Jeremiah in Parashat Behar does talk about the exile. It talks about this dream that Yirmiyahu has. And in his dream, he sees his uncle, Hanamel ben Shalu, and his uncle says to him, buy back the land of our inheritance, which he does. And then he says, and because God told him to do it, then he says to God, but why are you telling me to buy this land? Didn't you say that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed and we're going to be thrown into exile? God says, yes, I did. However, eventually the people will come back and they'll rebuild the houses and the land, etc. So this is a sign for you. So specifically, Parashat Behar is the one that has that Torah that talks about the exile, and not the Haftarah for Behukotai, which would also tie in this idea that they're related to each other. To make this more involved, I will say that the Midrash Tanchuma on Parashat Behar goes into great lengths to show that the various mitzvot and verses in Parashat Behar are all talking about what happens when the people go into the diaspora, into the galut, into exile. So it's definitely tying the idea of Behar and Behukotai together. what is this relationship between the Sabbath years, the Jubilee, and what it says, the blessings and the curses of Behukotai? I want to try and understand this by pointing out a few things. Number one, on the Sabbath year, you have this idea, first and foremost, that agriculture stops. There's no planting, there's no reaping, as it says at the beginning of the portion. There's also no selling of the safiach, which means even the wild bumper crop that comes up, definitely on the trees because of perennial, so all the trees will have fruit, even if you don't do anything. But except for keep them alive, make sure they're watered. But the crop, even if you don't plant and you don't harvest, there is a bumper crop that comes up. Not a lot, maybe. You planted tomatoes last year, you planted cucumbers last year, you'll get a few this year too. There's always a bumper crop, even if it's not a lot. Potatoes, you get potatoes. But of course, the Torah says, how can you live such a way? How could there be enough food? And the Torah in Parashat Behar promises there will be such a great crop in the sixth year. It'll be enough for the 3 years. What is the 3 years? According to Rashi, it's that 1 month at the end of the sixth year where we pre-start the sabbatical year, 1 month before the beginning of Elul. It's the sabbatical year itself where you can't plant, so what comes up in the bumper crop is very little. And of course, the eighth year, because the time that it takes to plant and then reap is also a half a year or more. So it could be even 8 months. So because of that, the Torah has to give this blessing, which is called a blessing for the 3 years. But what happens in the meantime? As we say, Ein somchim al hanes, even though the Torah promises it, what happens? Well, let's try to understand the scenario, how it would play out today. Today, of course, we have the economies of countries are more international. For instance, here in Israel, our flour doesn't even come from Israel, it comes from other countries. So there are a lot of countries, a lot of items come from other countries. You can buy sometimes dried fruits, they'll come from Turkey. Flour might come from the Ukraine or Russia or wherever it might come from today. I don't know, with the war going on. But you have international markets. Things come in from Europe, Israeli stuff goes out. So when you have international markets, you don't need as many agriculturalists. You need agriculturists in general because it's good to have. But I'm just saying on the day-to-day basis, not everything is based on that. Only a certain amount of the items you'll have in the supermarket are local. In old Israel, it used to be more than that, but a certain amount are local. So what would happen? You would have to have the people probably supporting a little bit the agriculturalists. Now, in every society, of course, there are things that you can do which are not connected directly to the Shmitta and the Shmitta year. You can have stuff left over from the sixth year, because today we have good ways of keeping it. It can be frozen. A lot of items that are frozen can be frozen for years. You have things in cans that can last for years. You have things in bottles which they took the air out of the bottle to keep it sealed in such a way it can also last for years. I look at the gefilte fish sometimes, it's for 3 years. Start wondering about that. But in general, things in cans, easily 3 years. So yes, of course, there can be things from the sixth year too, things that are bought from abroad because it's an international market, things that are grown in greenhouses, which are above the ground, various things on the Shmitta that can be done. However, probably the best way to keep the Shmitta without going into too many halacha details is what we call Otsar Beitin. In the Otsar Beitin, what's done is, if you have a kibbutz or a yeshuv, a moshav, an agricultural area in Israel, which wants to keep the strict way of keeping the Shmitta year, so what they do is they don't plant, they don't reap. They're allowed to irrigate, of course, things that are already existing, like trees. And then you have the bumper crop. Now, the bumper crop is not allowed to be sold. And rabbinically, you're not even supposed to use it because they're afraid that maybe you plant and say that it existed anyhow. It's what's called a rabbinic gezerah. So what is called Otsar Beitin is that the agriculturist who decides to join in this endeavor to do the Shmitta the original way and not go by what's called the heter michira, the selling of the produce of the land to a non-Jew, which I don't want to go into the details now. But what happens is they give over their produce to the jurisdiction of the court, the rabbinical court. The rabbinical court, what it does is it's connected to the buyers. And it says to the buyers, look, let's figure out how much it costs to bring this fruit or vegetables to the market. And you will pay, in other words, what you have to pay us is basically the cost of the market, because you can't pay us for the fruit because it's not allowed to. But today, between 50 to 60% of the cost of the fruit that you get at the supermarket is really the cost of bringing the fruit to market. Somebody has to take it down from the tree or take it out of the field, and then it has to be put into boxes. Different boxes, it's put on trucks. Then the trucks have to bring it to the central distribution area. Then from there, it has to be taken by other trucks to the various supermarkets around the country. So yes, that's the expensive part. And of course, middlemen, they take what they take. But the point is that that's the big cost. It would still be, so even the Otzar Beiti, where you're not paying, where the store is not paying for the cost of the price of the actual fruit or vegetable, there's still a cost in bringing it there, which they have to pay. Now, when it comes to the consumer who walks into the market, they're not really supposed to take more than that cost. But even if they do a little bit, it'll still be significantly less. Because of that, the one who's really losing out here is the agriculturalist, who's really not making money unless he has a relationship with the guys who bring it to market, but really not making much. So the people, because of the fact that they would be receiving this fruit and vegetables for a much reduced price, easily 30%, and sometimes I've seen it even lower than Otzar Beiti, lower than 30% less. So this is money really that they should donate to the farmers. And this is what has been done in a small way at the last sabbatical and the sabbatical before, where there are ways to give donations to these farmers who take part in the sabbatical year. And since you're getting their produce for this lower price, it also, makes sense to chip in and be part of that. What I'm trying to say is there's something about the sabbatical year where people have to help each other in order for the society to work, because you can't just have people coming into the fields. It has to be more organized like that, even if the produce belongs to all, which is the idea of the sabbatical year. It has to get to all in some way also when you take that into consideration. And when you talk about the Jubilee, this is even more significant because all the land goes back to the original owners, to the original tribes. And so when this happens, it creates a certain idea that God owns the lands because nobody else does anymore. Ki li kol haaretz, it says, because the land belongs to me, God says. That's why in the Jubilee goes back to me. And if there were ever any slaves, Hebrew slaves, they're left free, you shall proclaim freedom throughout the land. And there was also this idea of forgiving loans without going into details, even on the sabbatical year. So there's a certain idea of society trying to take responsibility one for another economically. When you look in Parashat Behar, there's a very significant motif. 5 times it mentions amitecha, which means your friend. When you're buying from your friend, when you're doing this from your friend, make sure not to cheat them, etc. in Parashat Behar. And 5 times it mentions your brother. Interesting thing is, when does it mention your brother? When it talks about somebody who is in financial crisis and says you should help them out. They call him your brother. Why your brother? Because your brother will help out even if you don't like him. But your friend will only help out if you like him. So they say, he's your brother, help him out. It's interesting, 5 times your friend when it talks about business transactions, 5 times your brother when it talks about helping somebody who lost their economic capabilities to a great extent, to help them out. Again, this idea of I am my brother's keeper on the collective level. In my opinion, this is the hidden reason behind the sabbatical year and why it's so important. It's teaching the society here in Israel, the Jewish society in general in Israel, how to live together as a collective, responsibly collective society, where people feel that I am my brother's keeper. Very important, a very important concept here. And in such a concept, we can understand why for the Torah it was so important to make this idea of the sabbatical and the Jubilee so important. Because the fabric of the society, the moral fabric of the society, is judged by how they treat each other. And the goal is to have a society where people feel this connection one to another, where they're not trying to subdue one another. They're not trying to scream at one another, make them enemies. They're trying to look for common denominators, even with those who we don't normally get along with, but your business partners, look at them also as your friends. They are helping you with your economics. The ones who have less, look at them as your brother. Feel this collective responsibility, because this is how society is built, and when the society is built on sturdy foundations of moral responsibility, it brings blessing, and then God sends his blessing too. Shalom, shalom.